I receive questions quite often about different types of amplification, right? And by that I mean like class A versus class AB versus class D versus all of those things,
Yeah.
right? Now the method 3 is a pure class A amplifier, correct?
It's
And
class A,
it
yes.
and it operates at what, 250 watts per channel?
That's
Is that
correct.
correct? So for the uninitiated, 250 watts of class A power is pretty crazy.
It is.
That's that's a lot of class A power. And typically, while you're listening to music on a class A amp outputting 250 watts power, not that people would necessarily listen at 250 watts because that's really loud, right? But that would generate enough heat where you could also cook on it and maybe heat your house and all these other things. So my question is, why class A as a first question,
Mhm.
right? So why choose that technology over saying I want to engineer some other type of amplification type? And then after we understand why class A, how do you then implement class A in a way that is the best for your working environment, right? So how do you eliminate heat? How do you make it functionally workable in somebody's home stereo system?
That is a great question, Giles, and it's certainly a rabbit hole. And it's very deep, but it's very interesting. So, Class A is one of the ways of amplification, but let me just first go a little bit into what an amplifier actually does. So,
Yeah,
if
yeah,
you look at the
please.
signal, as we all know, it comprises of a positive and a negative part. And so it moves very rapidly on the rhythm of the music between this positive and this negative part. So conventional amplifiers are basically only able to do half of this signal. So you have a positive part and a negative part. And the interesting phenomena happens when the signal goes from this positive part to the negative part, because then the negative part all of a sudden needs to basically take over the baton, if you will.
Sure.
Now that needs to go so fast, so smooth, that there is no such thing as what we call crossover distortion. If there is just the
Mhm.
slightest hesitation between the two parts of this amplifier, you will get crossover distortion, and that's really a bad thing. So to do this, one of the solutions is to put a current through all of these output devices so that they're always at the ready to start. And that essentially is class A. However, if you make that current so big that it's always enough to drive the speaker, that's a brute force class A amplifier. And that's the exact thing that you just described. You can cook an egg on it. It's all that heat is going to be dissipated into heat, really. So this amplifier is going to be really very hot, but it will sound outstanding because there's no crossover distortion. One of the things that usually is sort of a trade-off is make the amplifier have a certain current that's a bit lower so that it's not getting super hot. And at some point, they will switch over to what we call class AB. So if the current is enough to drive the speaker to, let's say, 5 watts, it will operate 5 watts in class A, and then the remainder will just actually switch one of the parts off because there's just simply not enough current to go
Right.
through both the speaker and to the other end of the amplifier.
So is that the distinction between A and AB? Meaning in class A, there's enough current so that, both ends are functional at all times, but AB is turning
One of
on
them
and off,
switches
so to
off.
speak?
Yeah, so if the signal
Right.
is positive, the negative part switches off because all of the current actually goes through the speaker. So there's no current
Right.
anymore for the negative side. And conversely, if you go to the other side, if you have a negative part of the signal, the positive part stops. So that will
Right.
create a
I'm with you.
bit of crossover distortion. And what you'll notice is that the moment you'll switch over into this class AB, the amplifier starts to sound a little different. And especially if you play louder, you'll get the urge to sort of tune it down a little because it starts to sound loud. Now, with a class
Okay.
A amplifier, you'll actually not experience this thing. You can turn up the volume. If it stays in class A, there is no part where all of a sudden you have this urge to bring it down. So that is in the one side the beautiful thing of a class A amplifier, but also it may actually lead to turning the volume up more and more and more because it sounds so pleasing. Which is a good
Maybe you
problem
do
to
need
have,
all those 250
except when you
watts.
have neighbors very close by.
Certainly. Right on. Cool. So what's your opinion on Class A versus Class D amplification, right? Are those, like, completely different use cases? And why did you choose A over D for this implementation?
Yeah, they are indeed completely different. If you look at the operation of a Class A amplifier, I just went into that a little bit. It's a
Mhm.
pure analog approach. And the one thing that I have actually not mentioned is that the Infigo Method 3 amplifier is Class A, where we keep all transistors conducting at all times, but we do a little different twist. So what we do, we add 25 watts to the signal that's being used by the speaker. So we essentially add it on top so that always both sides will conduct at all times. And that
Okay.
actually makes that amplifier stay in Class A operation. Nothing switches off. You will never get crossover distortion, but it's a bit of a twist to Class A. So that way we do not get that hot. So Class D, on the other hand, is another way to actually eliminate heat. And it's done by doing a switching between two voltages really fast in such a way that the speaker will see the sort of like average of these voltages that it switches to.
Right.
And that way
And
you
so
will.
that's when people talk about Class D, they'll talk about the switching frequency, and so the higher that number is that does that typically result in, like, a smoother kind of, uh,
Well, that depends a little bit
sound?
because there's always trade offs. Of course, you will want to have that as high as possible because it needs to be completely far away from the audio band. So
Right.
if we are interested in, for instance, well, DC all the way up to like 50 kilohertz or something, you will need to have a
Mhm.
switching frequency that is far beyond 50 kilohertz, at least twice as much. So you will
Okay.
want to have something that's more than 100 kilohertz switching. The higher you go with switching, the more demanding that gets for the switching elements. And so they need to be able and very nimble to do this. So there's always a little bit of a trade off. So if you go too far in high frequencies and the elements aren't capable of doing that properly anymore, then of course you will introduce other problems. So there's always a little bit of this trade off. One of the good advantages, and where a Class D is actually a very good amplifier to use, is if you need a very small footprint. For instance, in concerts, you will not want to move around 10 kilowatt amplifiers when they're not Class D because they're just simply too
Right.
big to handle. Also, the efficiency. No matter what, Class A and Class AB amplifiers are usually generating heat, where Class D amplifiers are the lowest heat generating amplifiers. So for that purpose, it's also very good. So if you have, for instance, a surround amplifier with 7 outputs or something, you may sooner look into a Class D amplification because of the amount of heat with all these channels than 7 Class A amplifiers for the same reason.
That makes sense. And from your point of view, though, it sounds like, when you're really looking for that best two-channel audio, experience, that the Class A is the right way to go?
That is, in my opinion, the right way to go. Yeah. And so I am absolutely addicted to the purity of a Class A. It's just all analog. So there is no trade off in switching. There's no switching frequencies in there. There's nothing that could essentially just somehow have a negative impact on the signal. We're just very purely amplifying the signal in the most pure way there is. So that's for me Class A all the way.